Προσωπικά τις ευχαριστίες μου στην
to express my appreciation and gratitude to the Academy for having undertaken to host this conference on this very highly specialized topic, and most above all I'd like to express my gratitude to the head of the local church, the Reverend Bishop of Dimitrias, Mr. Ignatius, for playing host to us all. I would also like to thank them very particularly because from what I have been able to know, this is the very first time we are having a conference on this topic, so highly specialized, meaning how to discuss the modern challenges through the perception of canons just as they were adopted at the time of their elaboration. This is the canonogenesis, the term I'm using. This is the time when the canons came to be over the first millenary of modern times. Already the theme echoes the issue as it is discussed through the main axis of this seminar, the historical relevance of the genesis of canons and the theology of the holy canons. I would like to visit with you certain topics, just as the head of the Academy has announced, and just as our Holy Father Patriarch has announced, and just as the Bishop of Dimitrias has also said, how these two worlds may correlate and truly be of relevance. When the Quinsexth Council innovated through the authenticity of its ecumenical nature, no one at the time was able to fathom that what it did was truly established through the centuries the spirit of how the genesis of canons happens and how the setting of canons is happening within the Church. Moreover, next to this council, through this operation of setting the canons, established a third pillar of theology, just as we experience it today, the canonical economy, and not the Western inspired term canonical law, which is what the theological schools use. This is the pillar of the pastoral guidance of the Church through the times all over the world, and through this initiative to methodically approach and systemically discuss the holy rules that were inherited, and that was what Canon 2 did. At the same time established a golden rule of management of the canonical heritage, which management goes through the four energies comprising the overall canonical operation of that council. As a matter of fact, besides the main mission that was common to other councils, meaning that of adoption of novel rules, the Quinsexth Council did many more things, 5 of them, all of them being innovations at the time. This Quinsexth Council confirmed by naming them the canonical rules, Canon 2, and even adopted 4 specific actions: interpretation, amendment, abrogation, and renovation of some holy canons that had been inherited. These quadrinomial that to our time is also a pursuit, meaning how and to what extent certain canons need to be abrogated or amended, was accomplished already by that council, and overall happened for all canons that preceded that activity, which is very actual and should be underscored, and which needs to be overall revisited and investigated in the light of all the times that lapsed since then and to this day. Any canon setting activity that followed, proportionately lesser and at 2 stages, the 7th Ecumenical Council, Canon 1, and Photius the Great in 703, that complemented this work with the establishment of the corpus of canons of the Church, were inspired by that council and its conclusions. We are now called to discuss whether it pertains the Church of our times or the Church of the future to also adopt similar activities of similar proportions, and the question is truly binomial on one part. How, to what extent something similar may happen, and on the other hand, whether something of this kind should take place. Do not know whether we'll be able to give an answer to these questions. Still, it will be interesting for us to albeit touch upon them and try to give some answers. Next page. There are some introductory ideas as to what we'll be discussing further on. The mere acknowledgement of the fact that the term innovation is a human invention that is born through the dialectic relationship between the old and the new, meaning old and new cultural phenomena, is enough for us to understand the depth of the fact that the Church exists both interhistorically and extra-historically, meaning eschatologically. Because the Church also exists within and beyond history, the Church may never be subject of either any innovation or any conservative adherence to the past. Consequently, in its existentialist version, the Church is not affected by any novelties or by any adherence to the past, because the eschatological essence of the Church remains the same in the future, in the present, and in the past. As we all know, the truth in which the Church participates never changes, never is renewed, nor is it becoming obsolete. It is the same, always remaining the same, unaltered. Now, how the Church is expected to express itself, which is both intra-historical and extra-historical, with respect to phenomena that the human being is experiencing as something novel. The answer to this question, it appears, is that not only is the Church entitled, but it should intervene both by way of eschatological orientation, this is what the whole liturgy does, and in terms of ontological landmarks. Those are the canons. In this course through history, the ultimate goal is to maintain the unity of the difference between the human, eschatological, and futuristic existence. Briefly, in any time and in view of historical facts, the attitude of the Church echoes the overall realities of the human being, both historical and eschatological, or, to use the Paulian terminology, takes into account both the life in Christ and the life with Christ.
Ιερών κανόνων στους κόλπους της Εκκλησίας.
This coexistence and what we're truly discussing here and now, this ongoing dialectic relationship between the intra-historic coherence and theology, in the spirit of these canons, we do see them as phenomena in general. The canons of our Holy Church, together with the Holy Scriptures and the dogmatic and council terms, are the main pillar in the life and the tradition of the Church, without, for that, predetermining the Church. The canons are a reflection and a recording of the live ontological experience of the Church body, whereas in many cases they even orient this body for the transcendence and the solution of issues that may emerge through the diffuse ambience of the fall through history, a course that leaves some historic traces that are maintained, recorded in a body of common acceptance, which is what we call the tradition of the Church, the canonical tradition of the Church. The canonical tradition of the Church was shaped in the time of the genesis of the canons throughout the first millennium. The ultimate date, landmark date, being year 883, when Photios the Great established, without being conscious of doing so and what his actions were meant, the corpus of canons of the Church, which has been relegated to us through gesta that are utilized in the Church today. This is also the constitution and the orientation by Kotlis. The genesis of the canons of the first millennium echoes the determination of the body of the Church ever since the beginning of its creation in the first century to discuss the eschata and the kingdom that are the point of reference of a full convergence with the trinomial God. These are the landmarks that are set historically through the Acts of the Apostles, the synergy of the Holy Spirit and the Church in this effort. The second term of this very composite term, theanthropon in Greek, human and God, also echoes a relevance as it is being discussed and even shaped by the history and by realities. For this reason, any canon originates from a specific period in time and reflects, besides the timeless experience of the Church, some conjunctural aspects of time and the context. In this way, a plethora of canons are established that need to be reconsidered at times in order to be co-interpreted and jointly accepted. But the course that the canons took also should be seen. The second millennium experienced a multiplication of canons that were meant to solve problems of the time but have no justification in the spirit of the first millennium. These issues had also triggered the emergence of the first canons of the Church. Consequently, the issues emerging in the second millennium clearly are neither relevant to nor are they being solved by reference to the text of the first millennium, which otherwise put means that the existing canons of the Church that are establishing the corpus of our ecclesiology have no ad hoc references or provisions as to the novel canonical issues of the second millennium and today. Consequently, there are issues in our time that are not discussed by either the chronological material of the first millennium or by the canons of the 11th and the 12th century of the interpreters of the canons. Therefore, once we have accepted this objectively, that is being widely shared, the urgent question to be tackled, because it is resurging time after time as of late, is the following. On one hand, whether there has been a relativization and even transcendence of the contents of some or all of the holy canons, given that they refer to realities that happened in other times under different historical conjunctures, or whether we as a church body, we may and should modernize, actualize and update these canons and even adopt new ones. Otherwise put, the question remains whether in the spirit of the authority these canons retain their authenticity in a changing world or not. A series of other relevant issues are also to be discussed very much close to the nucleus of the central question as binomia. Pandelis has already invoked them and they are being rediscussed and they could be food for thought for our theological faculties. For example, what is the relationship of the biblical spirit and the canons, or dogma and the canons, or the ethos and canons, the personal freedoms and the canon, the cosmic state and the canon, the psychology and canons, bioethics and canons? What is the role that the canons play in the structuring of the body of the Church or the pastoral mission of the Church? What is the mission of the canons in modern world, and given the participation in the ecumenical movement and the multifaceted challenges, and to what extent the canons are a timeless reflection of the Eucharistical and the eschatological ethos of the Church, or whether the canons are there to even stress further the authenticity of the spirit of this body, and how these canons reflect the modern structure of our society. For example, in the constitutional texts with different and diverging approaches, even at the local level. Of course, as to all these questions, we may add many more of them, as is, for example, what the next generations will be doing by adding more questions that we're not called happily to answer today. So, what are we theologically to do faced with these very urgent issues in a globalized conjuncture of ecclesiastical alternation and ecclesiastical culturalism? It is true that the canons are not the fruit of parthenogenesis, meaning that they are determined by elements of a specific time and conjuncture, but they do contain some aspects that reflect on the completeness of the vision that inspired those canons, and these should be taken into account in this attempted venture of studying and delving into the existing dialectic relationship between the relevance and the theology of our canons. This feature, an ad hoc reference of the canons to modern issues and the completeness of those canons, are also discussed within a context that sometimes is confusing, as is, for example, the context of the modern multicultural times and this stratification of the society at a multi-orthodox, multi-confessional, multi-religious, multi-political and multi-civic and multicultural context. This is historically very much novel context, something very new for our society, of this universal, common, multicultural context within which the theological completeness is being scorned, and sometimes a supposed multifaceted vacuum is being highlighted through reiterated argument by references to the recent past, that these canons are products of a different time and of other realities. Nevertheless, the emerging hypertrophia of manifestations of not ad hoc reference to the detriment of timelessness, completeness, creates a conflictual approach of issues that are established continuously in the context of the Church, and sometimes leads to impasses that more often than not touch upon the very two existentialist pillars of our Church, as is the local Church and the Council, and the canonical systems. For example, the issue of determination of the autonomous Church, that sometimes appears to be a major issue within the context of the erroneously referred to as diaspora. For the canonical tradition of the Church, therefore, there are no impasses, because there are actual ways, by way of eschatological possibilities, for these issues to be overcome, and there are the safeguards for transcendence. All it takes is for those who deal with these issues to coordinate and share a common vision. An actual way to deal with this issue that appears to be impossible to overcome is to interpret in a very specific way the historic relevance of the genesis of the canons, which is what we'll be discussing in this conference. This is an ample effort that has never happened until today. So this is an effort we should be undertaking as a counter-argument to any other discussion about those issues. Otherwise said, it is of primordial urgency to all of us and to our continuity to distinguish the elements of historical relevance from other aspects of theology, because until today, canons have been dealt with and utilized in the spirit of heterocentricity proper to jurists. For this to be better understood, we are expected to distinguish by isolating some relevant historical facts that have to do with a time at which those canons were issued, so that this second millennium may utilize these canons in a new spirit, and this new theology will be orienting the body of the Church to go ahead, leaving away and behind whatever conjunctural facts which, if allowed to be confused with the theology of canons, may only trigger further confusion and even lead to an erroneous stance of rejection of the canons. Let me go now further into the some terminology, relevance and theology, which is a misunderstood relationship. The canons of our Holy Church, although regulating the same problems, have the thematical units, and they are differentiated because of lack of identification, lack of identity of terminology. Hence the question whether the differences are really antinomial approaches between similar canons, which is an issue that many challengers of the authenticity of the canons put through, or whether they could be points of departure for a discussion of the same problem, which times and again emerges in different times and under different conjunctures. Let me nevertheless try to normalize the terminology. Relevance, it was adopted as a term for the interpretation, but the description of the function that this term refers to has been timeless and truly refers to the literature of the past. Even in ancient times, the term relevance, in terms of bringing two things in contact, maybe Sergius, Aristoteles, Plutarchus, and others. This relevance also historically is being visited in the Holy Canons. Further on, the term relevance is understood as the property of being relevant to something else, and even as interdependent. Then you see here in my text set forth in bold characters some terminologies referring to the historical character and the synchronicity of the canons vis-à-vis theology and the theological timelessness. In the next paragraph there in my text, you see there's a reference to the thematic approach of the canons, which in structure copied the Roman law and used the trinomial that is set forth on page 6 on top. The first two lines where every canon shows there is a specific issue. There is the causal fundament, the causal justification, and then the perspective, what the mission of the canon is, and then the ruling that is based on a canon, the epitimion in ecclesiastical terms. Then on, in this perspective, there are some terms you also can see in the next paragraph. There is relevance in time, relevance in space. There is a creation of relevance and a de-relevance. These are terms that are very novel. We need to use them in order to understand what these canons truly accomplish when read in the abstract. On that same page, down in the bottom, there are two things I'd like to read through. If these things are not taken into account in approaching these canons under the current conjuncture, we may slip in two errors. Either we methodologically go back in time and go away from relevance, or we may go back in time and lose the spirit of the true issue as it is set in today's time. Next page. I'd like to stress what Father Grigorios Papathomas said. Let's not forget that if historical facts of an event are altered, then the relevant theology is also altered. And Father Papathomas also said, typically, that those who do not know history correctly may not indulge in theology. And then there is a discussion of the various kinds of relevance, which, besides the historic relevance, are the spatial relevance, time relevance, perception relevance, ideological relevance, sociological relevance, and other kinds of relevance. All this should be taken into account, and precisely in the next paragraph, we have no time to discuss it right now, but you do have the text in hand to read. There is an example having to do with the way whereby justice is done, and it is interesting for it to see how we're shifting away from the legalistic relevance of Roman law, and we have arrived at a new kind of relevance where there is a copying of the legalistic relevance of Roman times without having a juxtaposition of the modern relevance. And on the same page 7, there's a technical distinction between the relevant rules and the time relevant rules with some inert operation of the latter. And the distinction here is quite schematic and only happens for methodological reasons. Page 8. Here I propose a distinction. The first millennium should be distinguished in 3 bi-periods as far as the genesis of canons is concerned. The first period from year 49 to 313. This is a time of persecutions. A second period, totally different from the first one, first century. So the 4th century, which is the period of tolerance, through to the time between 395 and 838. 5 centuries, the largest period over which the spirit and the historical relevance are different. Over these 9 subsequent months, centuries, there are different stages, persecutions, tolerance, but also some kind of reciprocity between the secular state and the church. But as you may understand, all this affects the field referred to as the historical relevance of the genesis of the canons. And second, although in this case there are different relevancies and certifications, their theology remains timelessness and the same. The same goes for the ontological content and the eschatological perspective of these canons. And the third thing, the prevalence of these canons is not changed by the change in historic relevance. Rather, it has to do with the fact that the theology of these canons is the same for now and forever. And then the next subchapter, there are also some extensions of the theological discussion of the relevance of the canons. Here I'm formulating a proposal for the interpretation of these canons going 3 questions. The first one, page 8, down below you can see it, how the Holy Canons may become a point of contact or friction between the ecclesiastical experience and history. Then on the next page, page 9, a second question is set forth, how this expression of experience is being experienced through the Holy Canons with respect to legal science and theology. Page 10, towards the end of this formulation of the third question, there's also, that's how I see it, we people today are losing in terms of perceiving the eschatological orientation with respect to the canons, and sometimes we do not know why the relativization is happening. And I have a text, you can read it. And third question, how these dual content Holy Canons may be interpreted. And on page 11 you see there are 3 different approaches, interpreting approaches of the Holy Canons. The first one is of historical, the second is legalistic, and the third one is the ontological approach. This is only the third one is relevant for the canons. The other 2 approaches are erroneous. And page 12.
Παρηχητικός τίτλος, ο οποίος...
There is another title, Trends as Tendencies, Stances and Instances. We have no time to go through these, but this is the crux of the whole issue. Please read through these texts at ease, and why there is a lack of relevance, legally speaking, of the Holy Canons, and what you will be reading will highlight many of the problems you may have had. Then, another chapter, the transformation of the canonical tradition of the Church over the second millennium as the cause for the modern issue of amendment of the canons. On the next 2 pages have an enumeration of examples of what I mean by the term mutation rather than transformation. There is a mutation here, the mutation of the acts of the Church, and are shown as canonical practice. And I'm reading into page 15, only the last paragraph, for you to see what are the derivations and what is the modern climate. These indicatively invoked mutations, next to many others happening, create some artificial canonicities that revindicate authenticity and try to ascribe the millennia of tradition of the Church. It's a situation of the second millennium created this modern major problem that is being seen in all efforts to solve problems of our times, theologically speaking, an issue, that of prismatic canonicity. Therefore, the overwhelming mutations of the tradition of the Church turn the church into a toolbox, and by altering it, they reduce the church with these new conditions, and moreover, because of this artificial reality, these canons seem to be obsolete. In this spirit of altered ecclesiacity that determines the culturally aberrant Christians, there is the virtual impression that these canons have become obsolete, hence the demand for amendments or substitution of these canons. And just indicatively, I'll be reading some remarks in the next page and some conclusions, and I will be then concluding my intervention. By perhaps overcoming my time allowed by 5 minutes, we refer first to the Queen-Sext Council, the fourth innovative actions already adopted by this council, the interpretation, amendment, abrogation, and renovation of the canons, hence the binomial of whether we could do just as much and whether we should be doing that. In that same perspective, we could also discuss the following: whether we might abrogate certain of the holy canons by invoking the argument or the excuse that they have become obsolete given the developments of our life. Some conclusions. The faith of our church and our fathers is very much relevant to time. It takes into account the conjuncture because it happens at a specific time. And even the symbols of our faith are relevant, just as a reference to Pontius Pilatus, because the symbol is not separated from historical context. It is also part of the eschatological reality of the Holy Liturgy. The canons are set not by the councils or the fathers or some faithful members of the church. They are exclusively the ecumenical council, which is not an institution of the church, an extraordinary event rather, and there is no provision as to when it happens and how it happens. I'm reminding how the apostles started their activities in the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Let us also stress, in order to approach this issue, and let us also be very careful on the fact that a standard practice of all ecumenical councils to reconfirm the authenticity of all previous canons through a systematization. That was the task of the Queen-Sext Council, by clarifying these canons without going into the classification or even the abrogation of canons that were repetitions or different versions of previous canons, are a fact that renew their power. And if this happened, has been happening since the Fourth Council, and also complemented by the Queen-Sext Council in an ad hoc way, and further reconfirmed by the Seventh Council, this might be the golden rule for these rules to be visited, those canons that because of their relevance or lack of relevance have become inert, and because these are canons that are very much associated to a time conjuncture and that played a role at a specific time, as is, for example, the demand to demolish non-Christian monuments that the local Council of Cartagena imposed. That decision served the purpose of raising whatever remnants of paganism they may have remained. In order to solve problems ever since, we should not be discussing without being very careful those canons that were also actual in the past. Canons, there are canons that did not deal with issues not known back then, but after the multifaceted intervention of the Queen-Sext Council, I believe the canons then set were able to cover everything. They were able to foresee and even predict everything. It is up to us now to interpret, and it is up to us to imperatively actualize these canons under the current conjunctures, not amending them, not abrogating them. Such task, of course, whether today or in the future, will be happening inadvertently in an unexpected case, for example, by the Fifth, the Sixth, and the Queen-Sext Council. Nevertheless, next to the assumption that the canons say it all and they remain very much actual, however changing the world around us, the issue remains open today and I believe that the canons should be also seen as a way to approach theology. Also, for the students of theology and those who delve in the canons to study, why sometimes the canons silence on certain issues. As Vasilius the Great said, this is part of the magic and part of the canonicity of the canon. If a canon remains tacit on an issue, it is because there are aspects that over time should be left without being directly managed, because there are aspects that are seen in a different light. This is part of the theological economy. 3 more observations, and these will be my final remarks. There may be issued new canons in the future, just as there may be new dogmas in the future, but this is an extraordinary fact, so extraordinary as an ecumenical council. The canons of the previous corpus of canons of the Church and the actual ones may not be adopted selectively and on a case-to-case basis, just as we have the selective use of canons. They should be seen as a whole, and their authenticity is holistic. So both in terms of time relevance, that has been explained as how it operates, and there are things we didn't really discuss, but they are on the text. Just as in the aspect of theology that renders them timelessness. In that, theology remains very much alive, and the relevance historically of the renovation will continue in terms of interpretation. By doing so, we will be acknowledging the Church as the only authentically interpreting the canons, both in content and in letter. The Church always interpreted canons. The canonistic interpretation by Zonaras Aristinos of the Middle Ages that showed that, but it is also true that the canons are very much relevant to conjunctures. How can we theologically correctly, and not by reference to relevancies, interpret Harold canons? As of a recent meeting of the prelates in Fanari, there have been a prelate who said that the Church exists for the nation, to highlight the mission of the nation in the world. Still, the canons have a different mission. They are calling, and very much vehemently, for a new orientation. This kind of attitude is not what we're looking for in in our times. The demand for relevance also, if seen absolutely, unfortunately contributes to the effort to render the Church a toolbox. So the interpretation of canons is experiencing a constant temptation. The relevance with respect to time, so within the context of the Church there is an ongoing juxtaposition of theology and relevance. When theology prevails for the interpretation of the canons, the eschatological mission of the Church remains intact, unshaken. On the other hand, if relevance prevails for the interpretation of the canons, the eschatological course of the Church is shaken, and sometimes is trapped within secular dimensions, however noble the intentions. And this is when the Church becomes aberrant in terms of secular eschatology. So the problem is not today to adopt new canons or to abrogate some inert canons that if we abrogate them, we believe we should be solving any eschatological problem. Rather, we need to interpret, and what we see as a weakness should be turned into a power of interpretation, so that these canons be rendered the true landmarks and inspiration for the future.